Story 1. I had a conversation with Bill Gates and did not know it was him. I was a splicer for the phone company and was trimming a tree on his property before I could do my work. He drove up and asked what I was doing. I told him it was the property owner's responsibility to keep trees away from the utilities. I gave him a free service and warned that I would charge him for my time if I had to come back. He was cool about it and asked a lot of questions about my truck. We brainstormed how to get my bucket into a tight spot. He thanked me, wished me luck, and drove through his gate into his compound. This happened in Medina, Washington, about 25 years ago. My coworker drove up and asked what he had said. I told him I had a friendly conversation with the property owner. He laughed because I did not know I had just spoken with the world's wealthiest man. Story 2. Met Ross Perot at a gas station when I was 16. I pulled into the station on fumes and learned they only accepted credit cards after 9 in the evening. I asked the driver of the next car if he would charge $10 for me in exchange for my cash. Ross Perot rolled down his back window and chatted with me about where I was headed, why I was out so late because I had been at orchestra rehearsal, and about the orchestra program and my scholarship. He filled my tank with $17 of gas, refused my $10, and donated to the orchestra program on the condition that my scholarship be funded for another year, until I finished high school. The donation would have covered me for several natural lifetimes. Story 3. My grandfather owned one Berkshire Hathaway Class B share for the thrill of attending the annual shareholder meeting. He took me once when I was a child. We lived about an hour from Omaha. More than a typical business meeting, brands in the portfolio handed out promotional items, and they often brought chess grandmasters and Scrabble champions to entertain shareholders as they lingered in the event center. So there I was, 9 years old, playing Scrabble against the former world champion when none other than Warren Buffett and his entourage and press came strolling up. He came up behind me, put his hands on my shoulders, and asked the Scrabble champion, "Are you winning?" The champion was winning. My grandfather might have owned a Class A share. I do not remember. I was 9. Story 4. My somewhat wealthy father-in-law bid on a vacation for 4 in a charity auction and won. He gave the trip to his 2 children and their spouses. It was a week-long trip to the privately owned Caribbean island called Palm Island. The second night it poured. We were at dinner when the billionaire who owned the island walked into the dining room wearing a muddy white t-shirt and jeans, looking disheveled. People at the resort criticized him, saying he had no respect for his customers and so on. We, who were not as wealthy as many others there, said nothing. The next night we met him at the bar after dinner. My wife spent the evening talking with his wife because they both had similar anxiety disorders and parenting concerns. I talked with him about various aspects of life. At one point he took a moment to apologize for his appearance the night before. His cart had broken down during the rainstorm, and he had pushed it through the mud so his wife would not get dirty. I wish I could remember his name, but he told me that while most billionaires are unpleasant, not all of them are. Story 5. I have known one for 30 years. He was merely kind of rich back then. Their lifestyle now is extravagant. My child was friends with a billionaire's child. I never met the father and only spent some time with the mother. If you have seen the documentary The Queen of Versailles, it was like that. I swear to God I would not trade places with any of them. There was so much dysfunction, sadness, and anger in that family. I hope the children are okay, but we do not want any more contact with those people. Story 6. I used to play poker with him regularly. He was very nice. One time I asked him about his Francois Paul Journe watch, and he took it off and threw it across the table for me to look at. It was a $60,000 watch, no big deal. He is a great guy. He offered to help me get a job after I graduated from college. Story 7. I have worked at Sun Microsystems, Oracle, Amazon Web Services, and Meta. I have seen or met the chief executive officers of all of them. Only one who seemed remotely human was Scott McNealy. Story 8. Our company was bought out by Vista Private Equity. Robert, who is the founder, chairman, and chief executive officer, visited our office. He gave a short speech and spoke with us afterward. None of the things he said stood out to me, but I was fascinated that one person in a room of about 100 people owned so much money. $10 billion by himself. I could not believe it. My mind kept saying that he could randomly give me $5 million and it would not matter to him at all. That is about 0.05%. It felt like saying he has about $10,000 and all I need is $5. Now that I think about it, I was so overwhelmed that I missed everything he said. Story 9. Craig Newmark of Craigslist introduced himself to me at a party. He was very nice and liked birds. Story 10. I met a Canadian gentleman in his late 20s to early 30s at a casino industry convention, the Global Gaming Expo. His father built wealth through automotive parts manufacturing firms and casinos and racetracks. The son was promoting a gaming idea using racetrack footage. The convention attracts many very wealthy people. I am sure there were other billionaires there, but he was the only one I recognized. To his credit, he had no entourage, promoted the product himself, and was very approachable. We talked for about 20 minutes about his product. He was down to earth, excited about what he was doing, and a little on the nerdy side. He was not an act. For someone so wealthy, he was very nice and able to relate to people. I also worked for a financial services firm owned by Hank Greenberg and Eli Broad. Eli Broad seemed okay. Hank Greenberg was unpleasant, and Greenberg's son was timid and afraid of him. Greenberg's first official act after taking our firm over was cutting compensation for sales personnel, which prompted 20% of us to leave in about 5 days. Hey, fuck those deadbeat guys who sell your product and make you your money, right? Needless to say, when the Securities and Exchange Commission and New York State went after him later for securities fraud, I was thrilled. Story 11. I think many people who worked in Silicon Valley from 1998 to 2002 will say yes. Story 12. A Canadian auto mogul was the keynote speaker at an awards ceremony. A few months after I shook his hand, he was charged with a sexual offense. Story 13. I worked at a soda fountain in Omaha during high school in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Warren Buffett would come in sometimes. He never tipped. Story 14. Yes. The tech titan. I was showing him an apartment in Greenwich Village. He was a strange man who did not say 10 words the entire time. Story 15. I worked with him often. He was down to earth and generous and seemed embarrassed by his wealth. He owned several supercars but generally drove a Volkswagen Touareg as his daily vehicle. Story 16. I have seen Bill Gates a handful of times around Seattle. Most notably, I saw him standing in line at Dick's near midnight to get a burger and fries. Story 17. I met a Chinese real estate billionaire, and he was lovely and quite giggly about the cookies at the event. Story 18. Yes, Bill Gates was at work multiple times. Steve Ballmer was at the gym, at conferences, and at work. He is fun to chat with. I chatted with him long after I left Microsoft. Story 19. I brought Oprah her lunch once. She did not acknowledge me. Story 20. Yes. I spoke to Sergey Brin very briefly and realized how foolish I sounded by comparison. Honorable mention. Larry Ellison was in his car behind me on my commute home, and I imagined what an amusing conversation it would be if he rear-ended me. Story 21. A few years ago, I saw Mark Cuban at Boa Steakhouse in Beverly Hills. He sat alone at the bar the entire time. My friend said it wasn't him, asking why a billionaire would sit alone. I told him billionaires are allowed to be alone. Story 22. I misread this as, have you ever seen a billboard in real life? And thought I could contribute. Story 23. I know two men. Both are somewhat on the spectrum. They are great businessmen but not necessarily great fathers or husbands. They are always engaged in business and have no chill. Story 24. Yes. I worked at Dimensional David Booth's company. The University of Chicago Booth School of Business was named for him after he donated $300 million. I saw him almost every day in the office of about 400 people. He had the front spot in the parking garage and, if I recall correctly, drove a Ferrari most days. He seemed well respected. I never heard anyone speak badly of him. The office felt like an art museum, and his wife at the time was a major supporter of the arts. I enjoyed working there and liked most of my coworkers. Story 25. I was at the Indiana Jones show at Hollywood Studios and spotted George Lucas in the audience. A few others noticed and asked for autographs, but I was content just having a sighting. Story 26. I live outside of Bentonville, Arkansas. Walmart land. It's not uncommon to see members of the Walton family walking or riding bikes around town. One time I was telling my child to get off a sculpture along a walking trail, and an older woman said, "Oh, he's fine. Don't worry about it." It was Alice Walton. I'm sure deep down the Walton family is incredibly weird and out of touch, but they do a decent job of coming across as mostly normal. The weirdest part is living in a real-life version of The Sims. Story 27. My child was in the Scouts, and I volunteered to manage his group during summer camp, where a billionaire was my co-counselor. We spent a week together taking care of 10-year-old children and enjoyed it. At the time, I had no idea who he was. I knew he was prominent because of the way he carried himself, but he was trying to hide his identity, and I did not care. I worked as a personal trainer for luminaries, so it was not the first time. He was an interesting person. His intellect and emotional intelligence were striking, and his sense of humor was the best part. Story 28. I worked for him for a couple of years. He still sends me a Christmas card and a gift each year. Story 29. I have been to a Taylor Swift concert a few times. Does that count? Story 30. I know a billionaire couple. She is amazing, but her husband, on the other hand, is a complete nightmare. Story 31. I worked as a valet at a famous five-star hotel in the District of Columbia. Some people were genuine. About 25% treated you like a real person and had sincere conversations, asking about you. I imagine those were the ones who were grateful or had been raised sensibly. Some threw money around like it was Monopoly. At checkout, Middle Eastern oil tycoons would walk through the lobby with stacks of $100 bills. The entire staff would line up as they handed out money. Some, specifically Michael Jordan and Dan Snyder, were extremely stingy. Michael Jordan smelled of alcohol, and Dan Snyder was whiny and demanding. Both apparently tipped in coins. Oprah moved all the furniture out of her suite and had her own furniture delivered in a moving truck. She also had many fresh flowers in her room daily. It was difficult for the bellboys. I parked Diddy's Maybach limousine but did not interact with him. If his car smelled like baby oil, I could not smell it over the marijuana. Dave Chappelle was very nice and down to earth. He smoked cigarettes on the side street where the staff took their breaks. Story 32. The Oracle of Omaha. I briefly shook his hand but did not have enough time to form an impression. Story 33. I met Princess Diana when I was 11. I did not ask about her net worth, but she was married to the future King of England then, so I assumed money was not her biggest problem. It was at the commissioning of a ship. Not much to say about it. We children were being mischievous and she smiled at us. My mother was once ejected from a sailing event for throwing a beer can at the then Prince Andrew. That is a much cooler story now than it was then. Story 34. Larry Ellison. He used to watch Monday Night Football with my parents and their friends from the early 1980s to the early 1990s. I guess he was all right back then. He has changed, though. He is scary now. Story 35. I saw Warren Stevens, number 1062 on the Forbes billionaire list, inside the new art museum he paid for in Little Rock. He was a completely ordinary Southern man of a certain age. If I had not previously seen his picture, I would not have given him a second look. Story 36. Yeah, Jerry Reinsdorf was in a Bentley at a gas station, fueling up across the street from a White Castle. He sat with the window down, eating a slider. I pulled up next to him and said, "Hey Jerry, nice ride. I am saving up for one like that." He rolled his eyes and continued to eat. Story 37. He showed up at my brother's New Year's party. My brother lived in a bougie little village with some expensive houses that backed up to his. During construction, he befriended a billionaire who would show up randomly whenever there was activity. My brother always hoped he would appear. This time he did, and for some reason he kept wanting to talk to me. Someone in his family had invented a kind of mobile phone technology. He invited me to fly with his group the next day to a rare game hunting preserve in Mexico, with an indoor and an outdoor chef. He had one seat left for me on the private jet, but I could not bring any bags. Part of me thought I might be the game. It was easy to say no. I have no interest in hunting, and the rare game reserve element worried me. When I told him I worked in comedy, he said he was jealous because he had just lost a close personal friend to boredom and that his wealth was not what it seemed. He encouraged me to take my chances, but I still declined. My brother and his friend were so jealous that when I said no, one of them turned and walked away, very upset. The billionaire noticed but still did not invite them. I never saw him again. My brother moved to another state before the next New Year's. Story 38. I have met several and engaged in one-on-ones with many. There are two broad categories. Some are full of hubris and act as if they are God's gift to mankind. Most, however, especially first-generation founders who built their businesses, are grounded, extremely hardworking, with 16 to 18 hours a day the norm, deeply thoughtful and measured risk-takers. They truly value out-of-the-box thinkers and people they can learn from because their primary goal is to keep learning, improving, and growing. I am self-made, though on a much smaller scale, and we have had deep conversations about value systems, the next big opportunities, and what to do next in life. It is truly lonely at the top. Once you have their trust, you would be amazed at how much they want to share. I also noticed that most married early and are monogamous. They keep their personal lives simple, which allows them to focus on building their businesses. Fun fact: many men driven by hubris had sad endings. One who showed me his plane later used it to escape regulators. Another who boasted about his 100 score, which I found repulsive, was later caught in a scandal and lost everything. His wife knew everything and chose to stay with him. By the way, the world of the super rich is strange. Story 39. 10 years ago, I was a valet in college at a hotel in a small city in Tennessee. One day, a man walked by in an oversized polo and cargo shorts. I looked at my coworker and said, "Dude, that guy looks exactly like Gabe Newell." Everyone on the job was pretty bro-ish, so none of them knew what Steam was or who he was. My coworker said he had checked in about 3 days earlier. We had had Samuel L. Jackson, Usher, and Jerry Seinfeld stay at the hotel before, and everyone would talk about them. I looked in the system and saw Gabe Newell's name as a guest. I thought that man is a billionaire, by far the wealthiest high-profile person to stay at this hotel. He dwarfed every other celebrity anyone had met. He was driving a cheap car like a Ford Focus and tipped a few dollars each time. As word got around, everyone started complaining that he had only given them $5. They had had no problem with his tips before they knew he was a billionaire. Laughing out loud anyway, I found out he had sent his son to one of the boarding schools in the area, and that was why he was there. I saw him in the lobby a few times, just sitting and chatting with his son, looking laid back. He seemed like a cool, down-to-earth guy. Story 40. I worked for two of those billionaires for 22 years. I met another billionaire in 2016. Combined, I estimate their net worth at $30 billion. Story 41. I worked at Nike for a long time and crossed paths with Phil Knight several times. He was an ordinary person, a running nerd with incredible business instincts, very polite and approachable. He paid his respects every year to the Japanese bank that helped him get started by hosting them at a golf event. He even waited in line for coffee with everyone else at the campus cafe. Imagine how strange it was to stand in line behind one of the richest people in the world, in a building he had built. The only special treatment I ever saw him accept was a reserved table at one of the campus restaurants. That seemed like a fair perk for him. Story 42. I sold electric scooters in Austin during South by Southwest a few years back. These scooters cost about $2,000, and people would typically test ride them for a while before considering buying one. A man in a purple suit sent his assistant to buy one, and the assistant declined a test ride. We advised customers to declare the scooter as a mobility device when flying. The man in the suit said he had a private jet. After the purchase, we looked up his name and found his net worth was $8 billion, earned mostly from his work in prosthetics. Story 43. I have met several wealthy people and spoken with a few. They range from the man giving a talk to my class about entrepreneurship wearing stained, ragged sweatpants to technology chief executive officers, to my friend's father, with whom we got very high on marijuana supplied by his personal grower while watching Walker and eating too much pizza. I am pretty sure I have eaten at a restaurant with some of them. We recently moved to San Jose, and our favorite restaurant is in a neighborhood known as a hangout for wealthy people. Story 44. I walked past George Lucas in downtown Chicago on a fairly empty street. He turned around with his bodyguard after he heard me say his name to my parents. I became so nervous that I could not even shake his hand and walked away quickly. Story 45. I'm not a billionaire, but I saw Kourtney Kardashian and Scott Disick at the airport in Cancun. Mason was only a few months old and no one recognized them except me. I turned to my husband and said, "That is Kourtney and Scott." He looked at them and they looked back at us angrily. They did not want to be recognized, and I did not even say it aloud. We stayed at the same resort, and the nanny had Mason all the time. It was an adults-only resort, so I am sure they paid enough to let Mason stay there. Story 46. William Randolph Hearst III and I had a nice conversation. Steve Jobs watched me demonstrate the Macintosh the day it was released in January 1984. I saw Bill Gates speak at the West Coast Computer Fair around 1982. Thinking about it now, I am not sure Gates or Jobs were billionaires at the time I saw them. Story 47. He was the primary shareholder and investor in the small company where I was an executive. We worked out of a small section of his main company's office. Our company had about 20 people in an office with roughly 500 employees. He loved fitness and the office had an excellent gym that was small enough to feel intimate. We often used the gym at the same time. He loved my dog, who often came to work with me and stayed in the gym because he had a dog of the same breed. We were gym companions and had typical conversations about sports, life, and other topics. We had a lot in common except for our net worths. We never discussed work in the gym, and I never forced conversation. I think he appreciated that because he clearly hated it when people brought up business or tried to force interaction there. Sometimes it was painful to watch people try to get FaceTime with him in the gym. This went on for about 5 years. We worked out together probably a few hundred times. Eventually, our company became successful enough that we needed our own space in the city, so I no longer used the main office gym. We did not speak much after that, aside from a few meetings. He mostly dealt with the chief executive officer directly, who was my boss, but I always had the impression he made sure I was taken care of. He was, and probably still is, a nice man. He loved his wife and children and talked about them often. He seemed to try to do right by his employees and business partners, and he was successful because of that. He was a quiet leader who let his team take the lead. You could walk past him in the office and never know him from any random person in accounting or engineering. Story 48. At my previous firm, Ivanka and Jared were clients. As an associate, I attended meetings to listen and take notes. I never interacted with them directly, but my boss often complained that they delayed payments and made dishonest excuses. Story 49. I've cooked for Gina Reinhardt a few times. Her barramundi had to be pan-fried, not cooked on the flat-top grill. Story 50. I was a manager at a firm where one of the Shark Tank investors was the chief executive officer. I met him a couple of times. He was incredibly friendly in conversation but a poor executive. Story 51. I waited on Tillman Fertitta, owner of Landry's Restaurants. He was also my boss because it was his restaurant, Mastro's. He was fine. He was not a needy guest and tipped a little over 20% of what the bill would have been. Story 52. I organized a conference in Europe where the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was a major contributor. Bill Gates attended and was very polite to us as organizers. He was pleased with the work we did and had a gentle, resting smile. Story 53. I lived in Dallas 20 years ago. On fall Saturday mornings, I could reliably see Mark Cuban sitting at the bar at 2 Rows on Greenville Avenue around 11 a.m. to noon watching the first couple of college football games. I sat near him many times. Story 54. I was friends with one, or at least I was. He inherited everything, even though he grew up in a trailer park. His father made all the money but did a poor job of passing on a work ethic to his children. Credit to the father for going from nothing to owning private jets and yachts. The man I know, now 36, is miserable and severely overweight. It is really sad. Story 55. I have worked near some and met a few. Most were nice and normal. Except Mark Zuckerberg is as odd as he seems and parks terribly. His wife is a completely normal and nice person, and I honestly do not understand how they are together. He acts like a toddler when he does something wrong and someone calls him out. Craig Newmark is very nice. Zhang Ying, Jack Ma's wife, is a riot. Jensen Huang has a fatherly manner. We talked about being bullied as children for being Asian and about how he has mixed-race children. I will say that Pham Not Vong is not a nice man. He and his eldest son are unpleasant. I hope people do not judge Vietnamese people because of him. Story 56. I was at a startup that went public. The founders became billionaires. It was strange because you knew they were worth a lot of money, yet they were the same people you had worked with the day before. They were good, solid people, just as geeky as before the initial public offering. Many billionaires exist only on paper. You cannot simply sell all your stock and cash out. They were nonetheless very well off. Story 57. Yes, 3 of them on different occasions. They all seemed very libertarian. Story 58. I will not say his name because I am distantly related. He was at a wedding I attended and we spoke for 2 seconds. Everyone else tried to get his attention. I did not know he was a billionaire. He was just my uncle's cousin. Story 59. I worked as a golf caddy and carried bags for several billionaires. It was wild to see the other members, who were merely millionaires, suck up to them. Story 60. Yes, the not-for-profit organization I used to work for was sponsored by a billionaire who made his money at a chemical company. He was one of the nicest, kindest men I have ever met. It did not matter who you were. He always treated you with respect. He passed away a decade or so ago. Story 61. I met Herb Kelleher, founder of Southwest Airlines. He was incredibly charming and funny. He could talk to 20 people and still make you feel like he was only talking to you. Story 62. I have met a few billionaires. One shares a love of cars and hockey. We talk often since he owns the company I work for. He also owns a professional hockey team and knows my son plays. Every time he sees me, he asks how my son is doing with hockey and how we like his team and its amenities, such as the food and the people. We also talk about cars, and I tease him about being rich, and he laughs. My work colleagues cannot believe I speak with him so openly and do not flatter him. I tell them he could have me fired for no reason, and if the reason is a joke, so be it. Another owns a nice Ferrari collection. We were talking about it one day. The next week, he handed me the keys to his 360 Challenge straight ale and said it was out front to check when I had a minute. Story 63. I saw Stan Kroenke at the International Council of Shopping Centers convention in Las Vegas. He was waiting in line for his badge like everyone else and was surprisingly alone. Story 64. I once worked with someone whose family was worth about $4 billion at the time, but he was not wealthy himself when we worked together. When we became friends, I did not know he came from money. I feel fortunate to have known him that way first. We were at a party in his hotel room. He invited everyone back after a concert. It started to get loud and I had a decent amount of party favors on me, so I became vigilant because of what I had. There was a knock at the door and I thought we would be kicked out, as had happened many times before. Hotel staff told him that the people in the neighboring room had complained about the noise, and they moved those guests to another floor. Then they handed him a bottle of vodka or gin because they thought we must be running low. I was shocked. A woman I was talking with, whom I later dated for a few months, asked if I had ever Googled his last name. Google was brand new then. I said no and wondered why I would do that. The next day at work I did and learned a lot about his family. I was working the front desk at the time. When he came in, we chatted for a bit, and I said I did not know his family gave out an architectural award. He smiled and said it was something his uncle did. He is now a billionaire, and his immediate family and most of the others I have met are among the nicest and kindest people I have known. Story 65. This was about 20 years ago. I worked in an information technology managed services company for venture capital firms. I was brought in to improve our service delivery, so I added in-person time with the founding partners. My first request from the senior-most partner, whose net worth was $8 billion, was to help him get his new BlackBerry's Bluetooth to work with his new car. It was a bespoke Ferrari with a minimal console. I had no idea what I was doing, but I guessed how to initiate pairing and entered 0000 as the pairing code. The device linked with the car, producing an escalating digital chime. He looked at me dead in the eye, wondering how I knew that was the trick. Without skipping a beat, I said, "I have one of these in yellow." He smiled authentically. We got along well, and I got to see how that side lives. Story 66. When I was a touring artist, we were hired to play for John Henry, a hedge fund billionaire and owner of the Boston Red Sox, on his yacht a few times. I rubbed shoulders with executives from Johnson & Johnson and all sorts of people at those corporate events. We played the Core Club in New York City frequently, which exposed us to the New York elite's nightlife. That was interesting. I remember my friend and I talking to a man dressed in a white tuxedo on the balcony one night at 2 a.m. My friend remarked that we would like to smoke a joint, but we did not have any, and the man chuckled. A short time later, I asked what he did for a living. It turned out he was the chief of police for Manhattan. I also knew the daughter of a real estate mogul who was very unassuming. You would not know she was wealthy. One of my very close friends in college came from substantial wealth. His grandfather, who had been sabotaging Nazi railroads at 15, went into real estate, sold a large amount of land to the government, and became very rich. You would never guess it because my friend looked like a bum. He was raised not to flaunt his wealth and to be financially responsible. Their homes and properties were extraordinary. Story 67. I was in graduate school at Stanford in the mid-2000s. We had a weekly seminar where people like Bill Gates and the founders of Google would come and give talks. It was a mandatory first-year course. I was drowning in coursework and used the hour to do homework. The only thing I remember was that Larry Page kept using the phrase, "solve search," which annoyed me. Story 68. Yes, he lived in my neighborhood years ago. He had the most regular-looking house. Meanwhile, my neighbors built extremely gaudy McMansions. Story 69. Yes, I attended 2 meetings with them. I must have said something they did not appreciate because when I asked the person who had invited me to those meetings about the project's progress and the likelihood of future meetings, he responded as if I were an agent of the Central Intelligence Agency whose security clearance had been downgraded. To add insult to injury, the suggestion I had made at those meetings was the one the billionaire implemented. The most notable thing about the billionaire was that they focused entirely on numerical data. Nothing qualitative factored into their thinking. I have never encountered anyone so focused on raw numbers in my work life. I also attended college with the daughter of an oil billionaire, who was a musician, but I never interacted with her. She was a year below me and studied a different subject. Story 70. I was at a company dinner when our CEO at the time came over and asked me to save the seat next to mine. We had dinner. He was funny and kind and tried to teach me how to play blackjack at the casino night. I was the receptionist at the time, so I did not understand why he chose to spend time with me when many others were trying to schmooze with him. Maybe he did not want to talk shop, which I am sure many people wanted to do. Truthfully, I was only there because I was the coordinator for the event. I was so intimidated that I did not have much to say, but I appreciated the time I spent with him. I wonder if most leaders are just regular people or if he was an exception. Story 71. My good friend's family is worth $2 billion. They are very kind people. I have known them for about 20 years, perhaps a little less. Her parents have always been welcoming. When I brought my daughter to their house, they showered her with gifts because they do not have grandchildren of their own. Story 72. A good friend of mine from university in Saudi Arabia has an incredible lifestyle, but faces very high stress and massive expectations to maintain it. I would not trade places. Story 73. I knew a man very well, and was around him daily, as he went from being unable to make payroll to becoming a billionaire with a private jet and a family office. His mother was an immigrant, and he truly started at the bottom. It was a wild ride. I spent time on the jet and saw what a billionaire's life is really like. It was eye-opening, and I learned how to apply aspects of it to my own life. Story 74. I had a few encounters. The most memorable was a relatively low-key meeting with Tim Cook. I must have been grabbing a Starbucks in Manhattan, off Hudson Street by the old Western Union building. I saw a man who looked like Tim Cook sitting there. An open seat was nearby, so I sat down, asked if it was him, and he confirmed. We chatted for a few minutes. He was a nice guy, and then I went on my way. Story 75. I work in the commercial seafood processing industry. The plant I work for is based in a tiny fishing village in southwest Alaska. We are a relatively small-scale operation compared to some of the other heavy hitters in the area. Around 2010, we were purchased by a very large privately held Canadian company. The owner flew out to our little outfit in the sticks to check things out after he purchased it. The man was already in his 90s at the time and apparently still worked a regularly scheduled 9 to 5, Monday through Friday workweek. He arrived with a large, doting, nervous crew of handlers who had a tightly controlled, scheduled itinerary for his time at our facility. The first 30 minutes or so went as planned. He met the office staff and human resources, supervisors, department heads, and so on. He shook everyone's hand, asked our names, how long we had worked for the company, where we grew up, and actually listened to what everyone had to say. To my knowledge, that is the one and only time I have spoken with a legitimate billionaire. Once the introductory pleasantries were over, the visit really got interesting. When he made his way down onto the processing floor with a team of about 10 nervous pencil pushers and lawyers, he immediately went off script and started wandering wherever his heart desired. He meandered through every department, between large moving pieces of equipment, behind forklifts, over and under production lines, talking with whoever seemed interesting about what they were doing. He really had a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory type of wide-eyed wonder throughout. Remember that this is a 90-plus-year-old billionaire basically running a Rube Goldberg tour of his own design throughout a highly dangerous, unfamiliar fish processing plant. His team were absolutely losing their minds the entire time. It was hilarious. After the plant tour, he sat down in our mess hall and ate lunch with us. One of our kitchen staff, well known for her fearless sense of humor, came up to him while he was eating and asked if he would like to hear a joke. "Why, yes, I would," he replied as his entourage, already visibly not impressed with our regular people food, shifted nervously in their seats. "Why do women make terrible carpenters?" Silence. "Because they spend their entire lives being told that this is 6 inches," she quipped, eyes squinting, holding up her thumb and index finger with less than a half-inch space between them. This man erupted into a fit of the most cartoonish rich guy laughter I have ever heard. It was a pretty great time. Story 76. I once saw Zuckerberg's yacht docked. It was larger than the building I was in. Story 77. I own a shop that deals with exotic cars. The customers are just like normal people. Some are kind and discreet about their wealth. Others are rude but equally discreet. There are also people who act rich. That attitude usually comes from those who started off ordinary and then got lucky. Some will haggle over a $50 discount. Some will not ask for a discount but will insist on paying to the exact cent. Neither under nor over. Many wealthy people on social media are insufferable. They act more important than others and resemble how movies and shows portray billionaires. One client, an elderly billionaire car enthusiast, would grab a wrench and help my staff diagnose problems. Essentially, they are normal people with more disposable income. Story 78. I laughed in Trump's face when he was chatting up my teenage friends in a dance club in the 1980s. He was not a billionaire yet, though. Story 79. I saw Rupert Murdoch give a talk at the press club in Washington, District of Columbia. Story 80. Yeah, the CEO of my former employer, an e-commerce company, was one, and he would just walk around the office like a normal person. Story 81. Yes, I used to frequent a dive bar across the street from a superyacht marina. Story 82. I do a lot of poker runs on the boat at major lakes and, by extension, have become close to many affluent people. A couple of years ago, I was doing a Miami to Key West poker run with a boat club. Before the run, a few of us went to Southport Raw Bar in Fort Lauderdale and some new people showed up. One of them asked if anyone wanted to take a ride down to Miami so he could pick up a friend and then come back, so I said I would go, thinking we were going to take the Intracoastal by boat. Instead, we took an Uber to his helicopter and flew there. When we returned, we landed on his friend's yacht at Yacht Row, outside our hotel. I found out the next day that it was John Woodruff of the Coca-Cola family. Big thanks to him. He lets us use his house in the Ozarks whenever we want now. Story 83. I've seen both Paul McCartney and Bruce Springsteen perform several times. In my opinion, both have truly earned it for all the joy they bring to so many people. Other billionaires have not. Story 84. I was on my high school track team with a daughter of a billionaire. I saw her dad from time to time. They were a completely normal family. You would never have guessed how wealthy they were compared to the rest of us. Story 85. I met Richard Branson at the Atlantis Resort in the Bahamas. He was relaxing alone in the pool. Story 86. I've known two billionaire families pretty well. One is totally normal, and unless you went to their houses or knew their super niche industry, you'd never know how much money they had. The other is from a long family lineage of money, and they're total asshats. Story 87. I worked at a sporting facility and stadium owned by the founder and chief executive officer of an oil, gas, and utilities company. He would stop by from time to time to tour the place before events, always stopping to say hello and see how we were doing. One time he needed some things moved around his garage, so they sent me and a few others to help him. His garage, with more than 30 cars, was filled with classic luxury and sports cars. It was incredible. He saw me looking around, came over with a smile and asked, "So, see anything you like?" Story 88. 2022 Eastern Conference Finals between the Miami Heat and the Boston Celtics. There was a whiteout in Miami. I was 12 rows from the court and the only person in my section wearing Celtics green. Then team owner WIC Grousbeck walked down, tapped me on the shoulder, and extended his hand. I stood up and called out Mr. Grousbeck, and we greeted each other as if we had known each other for 30 years. He said, "Thank you for coming out tonight." Needless to say, my section was horrified. Story 89. I own a private dining company in New York. They pay their invoices on time. Billionaires are good people. Story 90. Yes, I was having a beer in the park when I saw him. I greeted him from a distance, and he came over to say hello. It was really nice. Story 91. I worked in the entertainment industry in Hollywood and saw many billionaires on set and at award shows. Jerry Seinfeld was one of them. Story 92. I was a chauffeur for about 5 years and had 4 different billionaires request me from the service I worked for. Only one of the 4 tipped a $100 bill each time. The others gave only a $20 bill, if that. Story 93. Tyler Perry paid nearly $1 million for my cousin's wedding at a lakeside palace in Italy. The man takes care of his people. He may have started speaking in tongues when he took center stage with a microphone during the ceremony. Story 94. Yes. At the luxury jewelry store where I worked, he was just a man like any other. Story 95. Yes, my chief executive officer once visited the junior engineers. Story 96. I worked at Microsoft from 1986 to 1996. I met many people there, including Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, Larson, Letwin, Charles Simonyi, both of the Mervolds, and Gabe Newell, who was a Microsoft employee at the time. Story 97. I see them all the time walking around New York City. The best was George Soros in Central Park, wearing slacks, a button-down shirt, and a sweater. No one recognized or noticed him. He seemed like a friendly grandfather. I saw Caroline Kennedy walking the family dog at dusk. Again, no one recognized her. I went to Graydon Carter's book party. There were many billionaires, including Mike Bloomberg, who hosted, and Barry Diller. You encounter them frequently in New York City, and I do not even work in finance. Story 98. I once ran into Ted Leonsis in an elevator at the Capital One Center in Washington, D.C. before a basketball game. He is the owner of the Capitals and the Wizards. I did not realize who he was until someone pointed it out after he left the elevator. He was shorter than I expected but well-dressed. He wore casual dress shoes and a sports coat. He did not say a word. He only smiled when I looked at him. Then he got off the elevator. Story 99. Mark Nunnally of Bain Capital was a close friend of our startup's chief executive officer. As the chief executive officer's chief of staff, I saw him at many events and board meetings. Mark and his wife were always exceptionally kind and genuine. They were the only people at that level who treated me like a human being. Others I met were not billionaires but had hundreds of millions and were extremely rude. They would change their pace to avoid speaking to me in a hallway. Story 100. I met a handful of billionaires when I worked at a luxury hotel in Rhode Island. Most of them were cool. Wendy Schmidt was the wealthiest and a regular at the hotel. She is the wife of the chief executive officer of Google. She came into town to do philanthropy work, which is great, but I bent over backwards for her when she showed up a day before her reservation and I was the only employee in the hotel. She never tipped anyone a dime, which made me pretty upset. Another guest was a major California real estate mogul who came with his family. He had his staff fly in his sailboat and equipment a few days before he arrived. He was always perfectly nice, and I enjoyed him. He was hit by a car while riding his bike in town, and I felt terrible. I don't think he returned after that. I met Mr. Cho, the chief executive officer of Korean Airlines. He had a whole security team with him, and it was a huge deal for him to show up, only for him to have to leave an hour after he arrived for an emergency. I later realized I was thinking of the president of the World Bank. I almost met the Fangel brothers. It might have just been Pepe Fangel, and it filled me with rage that we were about to be hosting modern-day slaveholders. They run the Domino Sugar Company, but they no-showed on their reservation. My favorite guest of all time was probably not a billionaire, I can't remember, but he was the former chief executive officer of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Georgia, and he was the kindest rich guy I ever met. He handed out $100 bills to everyone, asked what you wanted from Starbucks every morning, and would get you something random if you said you didn't want anything. Mumford & Sons were not billionaires, but total jerks. That's all I got. Story 101. Mark Cuban was very drunk at Mother Bear's in Bloomington in the early 2000s. He bought everyone a round of drinks. Story 102. Back around 2009, I was repairing automatic doors in the Seattle area. One night, I got a call at about 11 at night to repair a door at Swedish Children's Hospital. I arrived and started working on a really old Horton cable drive automatic door. A well-dressed man appeared and began watching me. I was already annoyed at being called out late to work on a lousy door. So after a few minutes, I asked if he needed help. He said he was just waiting for someone to come out of the hospital. A few minutes later, he asked me to stop working so the people he was waiting for could use the door. I had the door torn apart and a very sharp steel cable I had not yet disconnected. So I had to grab the frayed cable and hold it out of the way. I had been told the door would not be used before I started. I grabbed the cable and out walked Bill and Melinda Gates and their daughter, who looked like she had a leg injury from a soccer game and was still in her soccer uniform. The man watching me turned out to be Bill Gates's driver and bodyguard. They walked out through the door while I was on a ladder holding the greasy, frayed cable out of the way. They left and I finished fixing the door. I got some scratches and pokes from the cable, but the overtime paid well. They seemed like normal people. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.